Today on the State of the Nation, we have the former leader of the opposition in the South African Parliament, and that is Tony Leon, former leader of the Democratic Alliance. Tony, welcome to State of the Nation. Good to have you here in person.
Absolutely. Good to be here. Nice to be with you in this format.
Yeah.
Previously used to appear for you in public platforms, but you've now transitioned into the digital age, and congratulations.
Yeah, so, a whole different world. Absolutely. And, we've now got a dedicated subscriber base. So if you are watching this and you haven't subscribe to the channel, please. So, Tony and we did one or two virtual events, but that's not the same as having the guy here. But Tony, you're no longer actively involved in politics, but it'll never leave you. That's what you're known for. And I know that you're a regular columnist and you keep abreast of what's going on in South Africa and abroad. Let's start off with abroad, because one of your roles, when you actually resigned from Parliament, your role as the leader of the opposition, you were lassoed by then President Jacob Zuma to become South Africa's ambassador to Argentina. And you wrote a wonderful book, which is here somewhere. Right there, The Accidental Ambassador, yes. Which I would actually really recommend to anybody. I don't know if it's still around, but it really is a wonderful read, where you became the ambassador to Argentina, and you spent how many, 4 years there?
Just under.
Yeah, and you certainly saw that environment up close. And the reason why I'm talking Argentina is that there are some similarities with Argentina and South Africa, aren't there?
They absolutely are, apart from rugby.
Yes.
And we're on other sides of the South Atlantic. And let's just remove the racial factor, which isn't a feature in Argentina, and there's a long history about that. Argentina is largely a white society. But that's where the dissimilarities end. The similarities are very striking. So Argentina, famously, at the advent of the Second World War, was one of the 10 richest countries in the world. Today, its economy is smaller than South Africa's. And it has probably, I think I'm correct in saying this, even greater natural resource than South Africa. Certainly in agriculture, it shoots the lights out with their soybean production, one of the 2 or 3 highest in the world of soybean exporters. As far as minerals, they've got gold, they've got lithium, they've got shale gas, they have everything. Well, basically any country on either side of the Andes is a mineral treasure trove. But they've also got shocking governance, so that's a similarity, a big similarity. And the book you wrote about, or you mentioned that I wrote about when I came back, called The Accidental Ambassador, From Parliament to Patagonia, I wrote the chapter on Argentinian politics. I called it Vote for a Better Yesterday, because most of the politics of Argentina was dominated by one party, broadly called the Peronists, although it's divided into various factions, but it's Peronism, which is almost impossible to define because it changes shape and form, but is basically about power and about populism and about public subsidies. Also sounds familiar to you. And it is really refracting everything through the lens of Juan and Evita Peron. And she, as in Santa Evita, she's known, died in 1952. And I was scratching my head when I got there in 2009 saying, well, why this obsession about someone who died age 37 in 1952? Well, you might ask yourself about South Africa, where we actually look back to apartheid, because that's a comfortable place for the ANC. I mean, it was a very difficult time, of course, if you were not white, but the ANC was an innocent victim, if you like, and it did a huge amount to bring about the end of apartheid. But that happened effectively in 1990 and consolidated with the election in 1994. So we spent the last 29 years here looking back. Well, Argentina, a lot of Argentinian politics is looking back. Well, now what happened last night in Argentina in the presidential runoff election is that a complete outsider, a sort of Trump on steroids with a chainsaw, used to go around his rallies, Javier Milei, really barely been in Congress, I think, for 2 or 3 years. He has no party to speak of. They've got 8 senators out of 70. Won the election by Argentina stands a landslide. And a friend of mine who lives in Buenos Aires sent me a message late last night, and he said, it doesn't matter that this man might be a lunatic, El Loco, Mr. Milei wants to dollarize the economy, he wants to allow human trade and organs because he's an extreme libertarian and anarcho-capitalist. He said, if you are defending a record with 1,400% inflation, which the other candidate was doing from the Peronists, you're never going to get the support. And so, although Argentinians have been deeply embedded in Peronism, I think, as we say in the good old South African lingo, genoeg is genoeg, or was genoeg. So enough was enough. And that's what happened. Now, look, this is a bit of a wild ride they're on. I mean, we don't have to go into the merits or demerits of Millet and how he's going to be as president, but it's a warning. You can say, well, it's a populism rises, the return of the right wing, all true, maybe. The real issue to me that poll showed up is that with people impoverished. When I left Argentina, the poverty rate was 7%. Today it is 40%. Now, I left Argentina at the end of 2012, so we're not talking so long ago. So in a decade plus, they have immiserated the nation. Now, our friends here in the ANC have done exactly the same, just over a longer period. So that might suggest that certain changes will happen here too. I don't know. No two situations are exact, but it was interesting.
So the sort of one of the lessons from Argentina seems to be the longer you support madness, which was Peronism. And I think we need to explain to people exactly what the Peronists did. I mean, the Peronists seemed to abandon logic completely when it came to economic issues.
Well, they did, but they did not abandon electoral logic. So what they did is a bit like, the social grants in South Africa. They were extremely astute at buying off big swathes of the electorate with subsidies. I mean, when I was living in Buenos Aires, Mike, you could literally get on the train from Buenos Aires center to the airport, which Sesa, which is maybe 40 kilometers away, I think would cost you the equivalent of 20 cents because it was all subsidized. Electricity was subsidized, gas was subsidized. They even tried to subsidize meat because every Argentinian has to have red meat, you see. And but the cost was ruinous because they just ran up more and more debt. Well, it also sounds familiar to you. If you look at our budget, the God and Ghana's recent statement. And eventually it was unsustainable. And so what Argentina did, it borrowed money from the IMF in their case, defaulted. I think it's had more sovereign debt defaults than any other country in economic history. And, and people then had lost all their faith in the local currency. So they converted to dollars because the dollar obviously is a much more stable currency, much more value. And there was this huge gap between the official rate of the exchange and the black market rate, the blue peso it's called. And eventually just prices became unsustainable. And the model ran out of gas because, as Mrs. Thatcher famously said, the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money to spend. Well, in their case, they ran out of the money and they wouldn't curtail their spending. And then they tried to, it's a long and sorry tale, which we probably don't have time to unpack. But it certainly was a huge belief in the state. The Peronists believe that the state can direct and control the economy. Might sound familiar to our viewers here in South Africa. That the state would be the sort of, to use a phrase, the fairy godmother at every christening and the mourner at every funeral. It would sort of be cradle to grave and beyond. And that with the electoral ingredient of Peronism, also sounds familiar to local audience here, was division. So they sort of, Julius Malema on steroids. So the Peronists would whip up one section of the country, usually on a class basis, against another set. And incidentally, a bit like South Africa, let me say, there's a basis for it. I mean, Argentina is still controlled economically by maybe 300 or 400 rich families who actually, the money, the very little public trading of shares is privately held. And it is absolutely correct that when the Peronists came to power in the late 1940s, under Colonel Juan Domingo Perón, there was enormous discrimination against working class people. There were very, very huge disadvantages if you were poor. So there was a need to change that. But of course, once they started the changes, they couldn't let go. And they doubled down on what had once worked, no longer worked. And so in that sense, it's a rather long answer to your short question. There are some eerie parallels between South Africa and Argentina. Not exact, but striking.
Yeah, because I suppose once you start a housing list, right, I'm going to keep voting for that party until I actually get my house on that list.
Yeah.
So, I'm never going to say, let's actually give up on this this place and let me give up on the idea of having a free home. You're going to keep going until your name appears on this magical list.
But eventually people just become so... That's why we'll vote for something. I mean, it wasn't that Milei was a conventional candidate. He was utterly unconventional, with hair and the tantric sex and the 5 dogs we took advice from and his extreme libertarianism. Because I think a level of desperation is reached where people say, no more politics as usual. I think you saw that in America when Trump was elected. You saw it in Brazil where Bolsonaro was elected. I mean, these are not ordinary candidates, but they also meet at a point where societies become so up to their necks in displeasure at how they've been treated and taken for granted that they rise up and they choose even an extreme alternative is think this guy's going to break the mold, he's going to drain the swamp, change the system. Whether he can do it, of course, is a very, very different matter.
Yeah. No, and the concern to people watching this might be that a party like the Peronists, which, for that we could read any number of parties, ZANU, the ANC, become very adept in dealing with normal political opposition, don't they? They've become very good at beating a guy who says, no, guys, let's just do something that makes a little bit more sense. Let's just govern better. They're quite good at derailing that.
If they do, look, sometimes I have to say the Peronist candidate in Sunday night's election in Argentina was far better than the previous candidate. He was a minister of the economy, but he was quite a decent guy, and he'd been a big figure in the province of Buenos Aires when I was there. So he was quite sensible.
The point I'm getting to is that they can play a normal politician.
Yes.
Clearly where the system cannot function eventually is when somebody mad comes along, like Trump, like Bolsonaro in Brazil,
or Milei
in Argentina. You get somebody that comes from absolutely, mad. I suppose we kind of have that in South Africa with some of the traction of a Gayton McKenzie, where he comes in, he says, I'm going to suspend the Constitution, I'm going to hang people, I'll put God back in the classroom, etc. That kind of sort of extra,
And that will get some support here because people are really so... I think in the next election in South Africa, which is probably next April, the opposition here is going to have to actually make the claim, we are the change. We're not just politics as normal, but we're going to do it in a bounded way. We're not going to, run off the reservation and go completely bonkers.
But it seems like it has to get a little bit more theatrical because otherwise people aren't going to understand that we do have problems in South Africa.
Oh, I think, Mike, if I can interrupt you, sorry. I think South Africans understand there are big problems in South Africa, and this is an impression. I don't have the data points to confirm it. But I think there also are increasingly more people than ever think that the people who've caused the problem are not the people to fix the problem. I think that is starting to enter the consciousness of a lot more voters than has ever been the case since I was around anyway.
Yeah, so
let's see.
Let's hope that that resonates with voters where they get that kind of message. Tony, on a similar, while we turn our gaze back to South Africa, there's been a lot going on in South Africa. One of the things that you would have observed is the multi-party charter, the meeting of the opposition parties that took place a few months back. Do you think that has any legs?
I think it does. Look, the critical thing, and this this is true when I was in politics, is even more true now. You've got to have momentum, particularly in the opposition, because you've got to create hope. And I think the lack of momentum on the opposition side has been people saying, well, okay, sound okay, or I don't like the ANC, or I maybe think you better. But what chance do you have? Because look at this big Goliath and you're little David, and it's not the Bible, it's actually an election. So David doesn't beat Goliath, and you're up against Goliath. So I think at least the multi-party charter suggests that a few different opposition parties can band together with a sort of bare bones agreement that they'll cooperate and form a government. And then you can look and say, well, so what? At best, it's about 32%. If it stops where it is, then you'd have a point that, well, maybe it's not going to do that much. I think this thing has got momentum. I think a lot of opposition voters and even dissenting ANC voters think, well, at least they're doing something. They're not just sitting in their separate corners and, railing against God. They're actually trying to cooperate. And it's not so easy, but they're trying. And I think there'll be other joiners. In fact, I would strongly imagine that opposition parties outside the EFF who don't join it will end up facing a punishment at the polls, because if you say to someone, look, here's a menu of 7 parties, you can choose the ACDP because you're very much in favor of, Christian principles implied in government, but know this, that the ACDP is going to cooperate with the DA and all the others, and they're going to help form a non-ANC government without the EFF. Well, so you can vote ACDP with confidence, and therefore the ACDP, which is a small party but it's got very clear principles, might actually do better. If you're one of these other fragmented parties on the opposition, some of them quite newly run, so, well, I'm standing outside of this. The voter who only has 1 vote, and you've got to make it count, when he thinks about it, might say, but he's not part of the charter, and so I'm going to waste my vote. Whereas you can vote for a small party that is part of the charter, and you have some hope, I'm not saying it's a huge hope, of landing up in a government or helping to topple the very lousy government that we've got. So I think momentum is everything in politics, and creating that sort of following wind, if you like, bit of excitement and some hope is an intangible, but it's a very, very important feature of what parties need as they face, a very important election.
Yeah.
Well, politicians say every election is important, but this one seems
does
like
feel
a crossroads moment. Yes.
Yeah. Now you did use a word that I think is quite apt for the moment, and that is fragmentation. Because I follow these things closely as you do, and certainly the by-election results that we've seen, or the subsequent political activity since our last election, seems to be showing a far more fragmented South Africa in terms of votes. The broad church idea seems to be failing.
Yeah, I think also, if we go back to the Argentinian example, I think what happens in high-stress societies, and Argentina's high-stress, we're a high-stress society for reasons you don't need me to elaborate. Every person watching this knows what stresses our society. I think then special niche, even extreme parties do tend to come to the fore, and they do tend to be more appealing. I mean, what's happened in South Africa, courtesy of the ANC, almost entirely, is the old idea of the Rainbow Nation has been broken, because the ANC realizes, as a black majority party with a black majority electorate, it's easier to win votes if you appeal to only one group and you basically stigmatize all the minorities, which is the opposite, if you like, what Mandela did, because he was interested in building a nation first and a party second, or at least they were co-equal. Now it's only about the party, not about the nation. What happens in that situation, and the government tends to be very dominant because it's a big party, it controls most of our society, is a lot of ethnic entrepreneurs come to the fore and they say, well, hang on, the ANC is doing this, I'm going to do that. So I'm going to be a coloured nationalist party, because actually this national project's not working. So, I think there's a lot of blame to go around. It's also quite legitimate. I mean, the other cause of fragmentation in our politics is our virtue, constitutional virtue, and we have an extreme system of proportional representation, which is very good if you're a minority, because you only need about 30 or 40,000 votes to get elected to parliament. It's very bad in terms of building broad-based big parties, because what's the incentive? I mean, Mr. Mike Sham would like to be king of his own castle and get to parliament, get a nice parliamentary salary and shout the odds. Why should he go and join the ANC or the DA, where he'll be one of several hundred MPs and, wait at the back of the line for whatever it is that's coming? He can form his own party and scrape together enough votes and get in. So almost our electoral system, which is, if you like, almost like a shock absorber against excluding anyone, is also to an extent exclusionary of building big political blocks, but encouraging fragmentation of those blocks. But look, and to go to your earlier question, one thing about the multi-party charter, it at least says, well, there might be 10 parties in this, but all of them have agreed to a broad base of cooperation after the election, which means you can at least vote for your preference, but know that it's also got an obligation to go and cooperate and coalesce with the others.
Now, we are heading to an era, seems unavoidable, of probably Yeah, I was saying to Corne Mulder the other day that it's probably never again in our lifetimes will we see an absolute majority party in this country. It looks unlikely. Never say never, but it's looking like we're in for a long period of coalition politics, whether we like it or not. And there's been a lot of talk about the ANC and their potential coalition options. From their first, they've got what seems to be the hierarchy of hopes. Their biggest hope is that they get 50% plus one. Depends on who the pollsters are. It's not looking that likely. Second prize is with a few entrepreneurial parties, Patricia de Lille, Bantu Alamisa, they'll sell their vote to whoever.
And they can carry on governing as before.
You just give them a minor ministry here or there. Third prize starts getting a little bit interesting. Probably IFP. Then there's been talk about the DA, and then somewhere along the line we all have the spectre of an EFF coalition with the ANC. What's your views on coalitions for the ANC? Because they will get the biggest chunk of the vote.
Well, I'm about the last person the ANC would consult on who their coalition partner would be, but I'd agree with both your premises. The first premise is, even if they do very badly, as one hopes they will be punished at the polls and deservedly do badly, they still will be the largest single party. The question is how big or how small that size is. So you've got the permutations exactly right. If they get in the mid-40s, they'll try and buy off the smaller parties, in which the IFP is a smaller party. I mean, it's only got on a good day, about 4% of the vote. But they committed to the multi-party pact. Well, let's see whether that survives an election outcome that's uncertain. I hope it does, but who knows? Because the IFP's played both sides. It's both governed with the ANC and it's governed with the DA in KwaZulu-Natal before. So it's got track record on both sides. I would, but then you get, if the ANC does really poorly, as they deserve to, but might not, but let's assume that they get the electoral comeuppance and they get in the low 40s. Well, then they can probably no permutation of smaller parties. They've got to make a choice with a bigger party. And there are really only two big parties, and they could not be more different. The one's the DA, and the other's the EFF. And that depends, first on what the EFF and the DA inclinations are and what the ANC inclinations are. And the consequences of that choice will be extraordinary. I tell you, if the EFF enters government, you should very seriously think of leaving this country. Because if you're a member of a minority group, if you're a property owner, if you're any of those things, because, take the EFF very seriously at face value. And if you want to know what South Africa looked like, go to Venezuela, because on his own acknowledgement, Julius Malema, who's I think in many ways, one of the most destructive people in modern politics in this country, and there's quite an overcrowded field there. Julius Malema's self-proclaimed hero is Hugo Chavez. Well, people in Caracas are, having to kill their domestic pets in order to eat. So that's the model. That's what stares us in the face. And it's not even if the EFF behaves as a model citizen, if they go in and suddenly embrace, Milton Friedman economics. A friend of mine who was a very significant diplomat here a few years back, but still very active, said to me, it doesn't really matter. The moment the ANC lets the EFF into national government, every single cent of foreign investment will flee out of this country, and you'll see a run on the rand like you've never seen. And that's not hyperbole. That's real, information. You can, of course, dismiss it, and you can, someone I deeply admired the other day said it's all overhyped rubbish, this about the EFF. Well, I wonder if it is, because the ANC has already, not very happily, co-governing two municipalities, neither of which were consently, Joburg, where we are now, and Ekurhuleni, which is, if it's possible, even in a worse state than Joburg is. And so we've got and Mr. Lessufi, I think, will do anything to stay in power provincially. And the EFF would probably say to him, okay, but the requirement is that we get into the national government. And if you had a strong president who could say, no, we have so far no further, Cyril Ramaphosa is not your guy, if that's what you're looking for. The man seems to have no firmness at all about anything. So I think that would be a devastating outcome, not just for politics, for the country. The DA, it's difficult all around. Difficult for the ANC, I suspect, but it's probably even more difficult for some people in the ANC to do business with the EFF. but not for others. I mean, Mr. Lessufi would, I think, tomorrow do a deal with the EFF, but I don't think he speaks for the whole ANC. The DA would have difficulties because they have a strong opposition brand. They'd now be a junior partner in an ANC still be dominated government. But if they could get an agreement which would allow them significant influence in determining policy and to some extent how the public service performs, I think it would be very difficult for the DA to refuse it at the outset. I think their voters might be surprised, but I think their voters, speaking as citizens, would be more aghast if the DA walked away from the possibility not just of government, which is arguable, but knowing that by the DA exiting the stage, the EFF enters the stage. I think that would be almost impossible for a lot of their supporters. So it's not easy. It's not easy. And even if the DA got a couple of ministries and even director generals, we have this ANC-dominated public service where we know that it's the cadres, not the merit system, that got them there. And that's going to be hard for anyone. I think even the Archangel Gabriel took over a ministry. He would be hard-pressed to do his beatic best, because he would find, well, the people he relies upon are not so much angelic as, in a biblical sense, rather devilish in their intentions, to use a rather overstretched analogy. But these are the choices, and they're always tough. And if they're not tough, they're not worth having, frankly, because they're not choices.
But now the DA, one could imagine an arrangement whereby you could have had, for example, a Deputy President Maimane. But it's very hard, I'd imagine, for the majority of South Africans to consider Deputy President Steenhuisen.
Well, I don't know that. I frankly don't know if most people think that because Paul Mashatile is black, he is the most outstanding, ethically pure and politically brilliant and dynamic deputy president the whole country could have. I don't know the answer to that. You do?
I do think we know the answer to that, and I think we're just kidding ourselves if we think that there is a different answer. And
what is the answer that Mashatile is?
I think quite simply right now, there's proof. I mean, there's been proof for 20 years that the DA does govern better where it governs.
Oh, absolutely,
right?
Yeah, I agree.
And I think that a significant chunk of people that don't vote for the DA know that, but they can't bring themselves to vote for the DA, and the DA gave that part of the electorate a lifeline by turning into the DA that we see today, which is...
Just hang on a minute. I don't want to, I was called in by Mr. Maimane to assess his leadership, among other things. And
yes.
We found that wanting. A 3-person report, and was accepted by the whole party, including him, ironically. The DA had a black leader in the last general election, and the DA, for the first time in its electoral history since 1994, lost 450,000 votes.
Yes.
So simply having a leader of a particular color at the top of the party doesn't electorally ensure success. And the real test of this, Mike, the real test is practically every opposition party outside the DA at the moment in South Africa is led by a person who is not white.
Yes.
And yet they haven't exactly gone ahead in leaps and bounds. So I'm not saying, of course, in South Africa and with our history, of course it's a factor. Are you saying to me that the racial identity of the guy at the top is the only determinant factor? I'm not so sure.
I'm not saying it's the only factor.
Whether
I say it's a significant factor.
And I don't know if Mr. Steenhuisen is offering himself as deputy president. He said the other day, I don't want to be... he seems a pretty realistic guy, John. I know him. He seems a realistic cross. He's not going to... He says, I would yield to someone else. Yeah. And let's see what comes out. I suspect this coalition story from the opposition side and the parties is not over yet. I think there are going to be some more moves. And I think the question you asked me is quite legitimate, incidentally, is in a way going to answer itself quite soon. I
just think that if one looks back at the 2019 election and the whole hype around Cyril Ramaphosa, the so-called business titan, and the guy with a smiley face and who was going to fix up the place, that to me accounts for more of the lost votes.
I think you might be right.
But that certainly wasn't in that report.
Can I take it? Well, we were given a very specific set of questions and we answered them. We didn't answer them, the party answered them.
Yeah.
There were 240 submissions from the DA about the quality of their leadership at the time. I didn't invent any of it. Anyway, that's history.
Yes.
But just, can I have a sidebar?
Yes,
you said yes because they're business friendly, so
yes.
anything but.
I'm saying at the time.
Well, it's entirely legitimate. That's what people thought.
Yes.
You've got tens of millions from
Peter Bruce.
White monopoly capitalists and all that. You know, it's a fantastic thing to me. It's a bit like I was in the opposition in the PFP and then the DP. So I was in that white minority that didn't support the National Party in the 1980s, and I got active in politics. But nowadays you can't find any white person who support the National Party. Well, of course, they won the elections by osmosis or magic. But, I, as you do, obviously, I encounter a lot of business people, folk, some of them leading figures, some middle management, all the time. This is my business these days, is business, not politics. I cannot find any one of them, and some of them are some figures of huge significance, who has any faith in Cyril Ramaphosa, or thinks, as they thought 5 years ago, that all we've got to do is encourage the reform element of the ANC, because I think it's in plain sight that there is no such thing. There is one indivisible ANC, rotten, incompetent, and is accountable for the fact that you and I have to, spend hundreds of thousands of rand, if we're lucky, if we have it, to mitigate against the collapse of electricity. Well, we've got a problem now because there's 71,000 containers, I don't know if you read, waiting to enter the port of Durban, my hometown. And these shipping lines are now so exasperated, they're sending their big tankers, or big containers to Mauritius, and then sending small. This is unbelievable. This in 1994, with all its sins of omission and commission, there were many. The ANC inherited the most advanced industrial economy in Africa. They have now reduced it, so we're now barely in the top 10. When our ships, the ships coming, have to go to Mauritius, this tiny Indian Ocean island, because they have a better chance of being offloaded than coming to Durban, we've got a problem. And the problem has one address.
Now, one of the ships that got offloaded quite quickly was the Lady R. Their port seemed to be working fine.
Yes.
And, around the same time, the ANC was having tremendous domestic problems in paying their staff. Oddly enough, from the moment that they seemed to throw their support behind the sort of Russia-China experiment, geopolitical experiment, and now their support in the Middle East for Hamas, they no longer seem to have any domestic financial problems. Do you think the two incidents are linked?
Oh, I'm sure they're linked, although to be fair to the ANC, their romance with sanctioned Russian oligarchs actually predated the Lady R's arrival last December in Simonstown. That is courtesy of a gentleman called Victor Vexelberg, whose Kalahari mine, I think, provides about 50% of the income to Chancellor House, which in turn funds the ANC. It's amazing that a governing party in any country which has got so much say in the economy actually has an investment company. Well, only in South Africa. But I think that's a fact. I think the second thing that's becoming increasingly plain, although the ANC likes the donations that come from AGOA or from our trade access to the European Union, they actually hate the donors. So they try and separate donation from donor. They want all the trade advantages, but they actually don't like the West. And that's quite clear. And the horror show that happened in Israel on the 7th of October, 22 attacks from terrorists from Hamas who murdered, butchered anyone who was Jewish or they thought was Jewish, like a pogrom of the old. You thought it wasn't going to happen again. It happened on the 7th of October. The ANC couldn't bring itself to condemn that. It took 9 days. First of all, it said the Jews had it coming was the first response. Basically, I can give you the polite version. That was the crude version. And then Cyril waited until Israel saw the inevitable hit back. And then said, on the one hand this, but on the other hand that. It was quite pathetic, but who does it impress? I don't even think it impresses South Africans because, frankly, I don't know why Muslim South Africans vote. Is it because of Palestine? I do know that there are 5 times as many Christian evangelicals in South Africa than there are Muslims. So if you're trying to divide and rule, well, maybe your calculation was a bit off. I don't know. I think it's because Israel, quite wrongly, but that's how they're seen as the representative of America in the middle of Araby. And so that'll bring one set, and it's a colonial society. It isn't, but that's how they present it. The problem with all that, of course, is you go back to the current concurrent conflicts in Ukraine, and it's exactly the reverse. Their Russian friends are, if you like, Israel. They're invading the neighbor. They are, committing human rights abuses. Not that I subscribe to what the ANC is saying about Gaza, but if you were to use their rather crude analysis, and yet on the Ukraine-Russia, South Africa supports Russia, not Ukraine and its sovereignty. And then, we have this grotesque fact. Look, the ANC and the government, but certainly, accelerated by the likes of Naledi Pandor, have very little influence in the world. You've got to disabuse. This is not Mandela. It's not 1994. And, no one gives slightest regard for what South Africa says. We do, of course, because we are South Africans. And I'm sure the Israelis get irritated, and I think maybe Americans, but I mean in the world at large. So when Parliament voted last Thursday to close the Israeli embassy, and I follow the foreign news quite closely, if things are right, there wasn't a single report anywhere in the world, like it doesn't matter. But South Africa does have a lot of access and a lot of influence in Africa, or you think it should have, because we're on all the AU councils and executives. And there is a genuine genocide right now in Darfur being committed by a particular faction who are killing black Africans in Darfur, of the Sudanese struggle there. And the ANC, the government of South Africa, when it was a woman called Emma Powell asked Naledi Pandor, hadn't even offered condolences to the 300,000 killed. We're not talking 13,000, 300,000. 3 million displaced. Nobody gives dimes. And I'm not engaging in whataboutism, because that, of course, you could say, what about this rather than that? I'm simply saying, where we've got influence and we've got access, we sit on our hands. Where we have no influence and little access, we bring out the megaphone. Remember, they weren't prepared to practice, what did they call it? The only quiet diplomacy in Zimbabwe, where we have huge influence, quietly. In Israel, we've got no influence, shout from the rooftops. It's actually pathetic. It is pathetic because almost it is an illustration of both our incompetence and also our complete absurdity in the world. And it's sorry for me because, as you saw, I was an ambassador. In 2009, we had quite a lot of standing in the world. In 1994, the world was open to South Africa. You go and read the opening paragraph. This Ricardo Hausman from Harvard, whom I know, produced a brilliant report on growth. No one will pay any notice in the union buildings, but it's a brilliant report. It's very diagnostic, very detailed. He starts off saying what South Africa was like in 94. It had an economy that was on the poise, now that sanctions are lifted, of going gangbusters, that it did for a few years. It had the admiration of the whole world. It had a very, very deep set of financial markets. And yet, all those advantages have been squandered.
Well, Tony, I'm sure that the people that have watched us today are the people that are living this. They understand what the points that we're putting out there. And as we said at many points in this discussion, the next election gives us an opportunity. This is going to be the first time that we're going to have a ruling party who may probably, likely dip below 50%, and that has huge implications. So the best we can do is consider very carefully and vote very carefully. You voted already very carefully to join us here on the State of the Nation. Seeing as though you've done that, you can subscribe to the channel. To Tony Leon, thank you, Tony, for coming to see us here in person in Gotham City, as we call Johannesburg now. It's great to see you.
Still, I love this place.
Yeah. Well, Tony, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll get you again. Thank you.
Thanks,
you.
Mark.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.